Okay, take two. We're trying this again. Hello, Nicholas. Hi, Ben. Good to see you. Oh, my phone. Excellent. Okay, so make sure, Christian, if you're hearing me, go ahead and turn the video on your phone. Hopefully it's a there you are. Okay, but you're still not, for some reason it still won't let you get added. Now on your phone. Christian, can you make sure that your phone is allowing you to use your camera and that you're connected to Wi-Fi? Sometimes it's an issue with bandwidth. Oh, good grief. Okay. Please stop that. Oh, goodness. There we are. Okay, let's try that. Yes, add. Adding. I'm adding you, Christian. Just give it a second. It's thinking. Hi, everybody.
Hello there.
Just a few minutes. There we are. Okay, excellent. Hi there,
Wow.
Christian. How are you?
The only problem is I can just barely hear you because now I'm on my phone instead of this fancy thing I bought that apparently will not run your. Anyway, hi. Here we all are.
Hi. Well, it'll work for Facebook Lives when there aren't two people involved. But if it's two people, this is the only way it works. So,
Fair enough.
yeah. How are you?
I'm great. And thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your leading me by the hand through levels of technology I really don't understand.
That's okay. That's okay. Some of us need to know how to battle in medieval armor, and some of us need to know how to do YouTube.
True,
So,
I have yet to write a novel in which anyone uses a cell phone.
very true. Yes. Well, maybe you'll do a time travel thing where a knight opens up a cell phone and starts talking on it or something.
Nick, do you know I used to write thrillers, like spy thrillers?
Oh
And
yeah.
and I wrote the last one in I think 2003, and my co-author was my dad, and we'd both been intelligence officers, and we used to say like our world ended with the cell phone. In
Yeah.
your hand,
Yeah.
you have a camera that can photograph documents. It can store immense amounts of images. Why do you need
Yeah.
spies?
I know. Yeah. Exactly. Well, either that or everybody's a spy, right?
Everyone is now a spy. Yeah, that's how it is.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's get official. Everybody, those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Nicholas Kotar. I'm an independently published author of epic fantasy inspired by Russian fairy tales, and I'm a big fan of Christian Cameron. Although
And I'm a
I've
big fan of and I'm a big fan of Nick's. He sent me his novel and it was awesome. And I would like to recommend. I've put it out a couple of times on Twitter. I'd really like to recommend you read it. And anyway, I will praise you later. Go ahead.
thank you, much appreciated. But I came to know you first as in your other alter ego as Miles Cameron, not as Christian Cameron, through your Trader Sun series, which I first listened to on audiobook, and I'll tell you a bit of a story. This doesn't end as well as begin as well as it ends. But when I first started listening to it, I was sure that I would hate it, and I don't know what it was, but maybe it was the narrator or something. I think it was the fact that the narrator pronounced the word domain as demesne,
Ah, yes.
which yeah, which I wanted to throttle him for that, but once I stuck with it for a little bit, and the story just grabbed me and it wouldn't let me go, and I stuck with it for all five novels until the very end. So that's how I got to know you, and we've done a little bit of Facebook Live before, although I set one up for you for your fans to ask questions, and today's the first time we're actually talking face to face. So that's me talking about you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and let's start there.
Okay, well, I write books, and it's my only job. And I only say that because an awful lot of fantasy and other authors have a day job. I had a day job. I was an officer in the U.S. Navy. That was my last day job.
Wow.
I have degrees in medieval history and in classics. Classics in this case meaning ancient Greek and Latin. And those aren't commonly found in the U.S. Navy, but somehow I managed to find a job there. I was in the Navy for a long time, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. That was before I grew my hair long.
Yeah.
I live in Toronto, Canada, with my wife and daughter. Toronto is one of the nicest cities. It is the nicest city I've ever lived in. I'd recommend it to anyone who wants a visit to a nice place where people mostly get along, although we've had a spate of killings lately, so maybe I shouldn't even say that.
I have noticed that.
Yeah. I write both historical fiction and fantasy. I do view them as being different, but I could tell you a million things about them that are similar. And now the more fantasy I write, I thought I knew a lot about fantasy because I've always run role-playing games and I've always played Dungeons and Dragons, and because my reading is mostly fantasy, I read a lot more fantasy than historical fiction. So I thought I really knew a lot about fantasy, and then I became a fantasy writer and discovered that actually I didn't know as much as I thought I did. It's a very different genre. It's got a very intense community, and it's not the same as historical fiction. Although, Nick, I'm going to say one thing that has really begun to interest me in the last 2 years is watching the historical fiction community start to pull together like the fantasy community. So,
that's great.
Instead of the authors all being independent, cats, as I think of them, they all started to like share stuff and be on social media, and there's actual groups and fan groups. It's looking a lot more like fantasy in the sort of outside in way, and the acceptance of criticism and the sharing, and that's good. I think it's as if historical fiction is adopting the most powerful and interesting parts of the fantasy community.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear it, because you do hear a lot of stories about the author business being a bit of a cutthroat business. So to see that kind of going away with the social media world is one of the nice things about social media. One of the few nice things.
Well, my dad is also a lifelong author, and my dad once told me that authors can't actually be friends, but I don't actually find that to be the case. I'm friends with Simon Turney in the historical fiction world. I don't know what I'd do without him, and I'm friends with lots of fantasy authors now. Nick Eames, Kings of the Wild, fantastic guy, just lives down the road in Kingston. I think we are Canadian fantasy at the moment. I have yet to meet Stephen Erickson, even though I worship his books. So I look forward to that happening eventually.
Oh, I hope so, yeah. Tell us a little bit about the other part of your life, which is historical reenactment.
Oh, I thought you were going to say being the father of a 14-year-old, because believe me, that is the other part of my life. Historical reenactments. I should be dressed up for this. Here I am in modern clothes. I spend an inordinate amount of my time and money dressed up for either the Middle Ages or ancient Greece. I used to do 18th century North America, but I've sort of moved on from that period because having a beard is strictly anathema in the 18th century. So medieval reenacting and ancient Greek reenacting are deeply experiential. To me, it's always experimental archaeology. Tomorrow morning when I wake up, I will pack the car to go off into the Adirondacks for 6 days with a bunch of friends in medieval kit. And mostly what we're going to do is cook and use tools. So it's not fighting. It's nothing to do with war. We're going to be living like wealthy peasants.
Good idea.
Well, but it's very experiential. It's really handy to know how to actually use a medieval axe, to know how very different a medieval shovel is from a modern shovel. Just as an example, in the Middle Ages, you use a pick to break up ground. Your shovel is made of wood, probably doesn't even have an iron toe, and it is only to pick up the loose dirt and move it somewhere else. It's like a little platform to move. You can't even carve the ground with it. And that may not sound wildly interesting. It may never make it into a novel, but people do say nice things about my books because they have the details, and a lot of those details come from reenacting. Oh, I'll also be
Well,
fishing with medieval fishing tackle
yeah. Oh, wow, that's amazing.
for real fish.
Wow, amazing. You know, you're not going to be that far away from me. I'm in sort of central New York. My Adirondacks are about an hour and a half
Well, you should come up and
north of
visit
where I
us.
am.
Come up and have dinner.
Well, yeah, yeah, maybe. Where are you guys? Where are you, how am I going to find you? I don't have my medieval GPS.
I could give you a GPS address when we're done. Saturday night, we're making ricotta and gnocchi, which is a medieval Italian dish. It's quite good, really.
I didn't realize gnocchi was medieval. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, somewhere, if I ran around the house with my camera, I could show you how we're packing on every surface in this house. And somewhere close
Awesome.
by is my medieval Italian cookbook, which is pretty fabulous. And I have to say, I think when people look at me on the internet, and partially it's because of the way I represent myself, you think
Yeah.
swords and armor. But
Yeah.
I'd like to say that
Which you do. Which you do.
absolutely, but cooking and dance are maybe more fun and definitely more
Yeah.
part of everyone's day-to-day life, and certainly mine. Like, uh, if you aren't eating medieval food, you're just putting on a costume.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I used to be a professor of not professor, I shouldn't say, it was high school. I used to be a teacher of history, and it was the big highlight for my kids every year when we would get together and do a semi-realistic medieval feast with trenchers and you
Cool.
know stuff like that. Yeah. So yeah, hey, at the end you can after we're done here, you can give me your coordinates and maybe I'll hop on by
You'd be
if this
welcome.
frog cold will
You
go away.
should you should
Thank you.
join us. You have a
Yeah, yeah,
great beard, great mustache, perfect hair.
Yeah, it's you should tell my dad this is a great mustache. It's
I
the shame of our
realize
family that we're not able to do better than this.
I realize what I'm about to say is probably going to be nationalistically offensive. But although there were no Russians that I know of serving in mercenary companies in Italy, there were a
Yeah,
lot of Hungarians. And Eastern Hungarians and Western Russians would have had a lot in common culturally. I think you
yeah,
should come.
it's true. Yeah, yeah. All right, all right. Well, maybe. Well, we'll hope. Hopefully, this silly this cold will go away, and my nine month pregnant wife won't start to go into labor in the next few
Oh,
days.
maybe you shouldn't come.
That's her talking right now. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you specifically about one part of that historical reenactment, which is the pilgrimage that you did recently. Some of my viewers might know what the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage route is, but probably most don't. So maybe you can talk about that, what you did and why you did that. And
Sure.
I'm just fascinated by it.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to start by saying a super dangerous thing, which is that I'm religious. And I recognize that immediately makes me sound like maybe I voted for Donald Trump and maybe we should just dive down a whole bunch of rabbit holes. I
You're talking to a deacon, so you're
Yeah,
fine.
okay. I'm a sort of good old fashioned Anglican. I go to church. I did theology in university, mostly for fun.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
wouldn't really like to be tested on what I exactly believe. And I will
Yeah.
totally admit that my life as a historian and my life as a Christian sometimes are in flat out conflict. We won't even
Uh-huh.
go there. Um,
Okay.
uh, and some of it can be quite paradoxical, and sometimes I just sort of float along and don't worry about it too much. Regardless, pilgrimage is a really important part of most of the world's religions. I
Yeah.
will say that on pilgrimage, so I guess I should start at the beginning. A whole bunch of my friends and I went on the Camino, the St. James de Compostela pilgrimage in medieval clothes with medieval
Hmm.
equipment. And
Amazing.
uh, so, 5 of the 9 people who walked with us were completely not religious and were really just enjoying the medieval experience or the hike. But every
Hmm.
night at the albergues, and the albergues are as much like a medieval inn as you ever actually want to experience in your life. Every
Yeah.
night at the
Yeah.
albergues, people would gather around me and my friend Elizabeth because we would say evening prayers every night. And they'd go like,
Oh
wow,
wow.
you're really doing this. So you're actually religious, which will give you an impression of how few people were actually religious. And it was just funny.
Right. Right.
Nobody was ever mean-spirited about it. But I remember
Yeah.
one night, like a whole crowd of young German hikers basically going like, wow,
Yeah.
you guys are actually praying. That's hilarious. Have some wine, which was fine. Uh, so we walked the Primitivo, the Primitivo that we walked, and by the way, let me start by saying there's no one Camino. I think there's 11 official Camino routes, but
Okay.
you can start in Canterbury, England. You can start in Cologne in Germany. I met someone who started in Moscow. So you can start
Wow.
wherever you want to start, and you can walk the whole thing. We met a young woman from New Zealand who had taken a ship to South America, walked to Toronto, then walked to St. John, New Brunswick, then got on a boat to Denmark, then walked to Berlin, and then walked down to the Compostela to the Camino.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
So my Camino was nothing like that. We flew into Oviedo in northern Spain, and we walked about 380 kilometers in 14 days.
Wow. Okay.
And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life, and I've had a pretty good life. It was beautiful. I mean, really, the scenery was incredible. I had no idea that northern Spain looked like mountainous Ireland, like green, beautiful farms, really nice, friendly people. We were in an area so wild, we met a wild boar trapped in a tree. Nicholas, you'll like this. You know how that happens in medieval tales? People come across an animal. We came across a wild boar caught between two trees, like for real. And then we told the local conservation officer where to find him, because he's going to be there. He'll still be there if somebody doesn't let him out. And it was, I don't know, it was amazing. It was the most medieval experience I've ever had. Staying in modern albergues was still like being in a Dungeons and Dragons inn, 40 people sleeping in a giant common room and like one tiny kitchen where you can cook your food and everybody sort of sits at the same table. A couple of nights we were in actual medieval inns that made it feel even more medieval because it was super medieval. At the end of a 30-kilometer walk, your one glass of wine is the best thing that's ever happened to you.
I can imagine.
And, we entered a little town called Borres where every house sits on top of its cowshed. And there were live cows in every house.
Wow.
Which you really only read about in the Middle Ages. But in Asturias in northern Spain, you can still see that.
Amazing. Incredible. So when's the memoir coming out?
It's not going to be a memoir. It's probably going to be a major chase scene. See, one of the things that I had never imagined before I walked the Camino, the Primitivo is super mountainous, like up and down. And we kept having the experience that you could see people just a few hundred meters away, but they were a half day behind you.
Wow.
And that makes for great fiction, right? Think of the chase scene you can have through the mountains, right?
Yeah, right.
I changed on the spot how part of book 3 of the Cold Iron Masters and Mages series, I think it's going to have a long chase scene in the mountains. It was going to have a chase scene, and now I just went like, okay, I have to like relive this experience. So.
Yeah, good for you. No, I mean, like you said, some of your readers make a point of noting the level of detail that you put into down to like what color the clothes are and what kind of weave and stuff like that. So this sort of thing is only going to make it better. So I'm excited about that.
I want to put in a pitch for another author. I don't know if you know Celia Friedman, C.S. Friedman.
No.
So she was my like adolescent game master. She was a huge spec fic author in her day. I think she still produces, but her Gerald Tarrant books in the 80s and early 90s were super well received and very popular. And she, by profession, was a costumer. And so she kind of got me into the notion. The first thing she'd make us do when we rolled up D&D characters was draw them. And we had to then explain what we were wearing. And, and that was super boring. And then it became interesting. And then it became exciting. It's not just wearing the clothes. It's reading about clothes. And I can be really boring on the subject of sword belts. I hate people who wear long swords on their backs. Because
talk about that. Because it's in every single fantasy novel now. So tell me why that's wrong.
Well, it's a super hard draw. It's really
Yeah.
hard to draw. So the biggest problem with a two-handed sword, drawing it, is that it's longer than your arm. You can imitate this with a stick or a broom handle.
Yeah.
Just try and draw something out of your belt that is longer than your arm. It's like, not coming out. So you could die trying to draw your sword. And if you think about reaching back over your head and pulling a long sword straight forward, it has no angle off your body. And by the way, the scabbard had to stand up straight behind you, right? Like, it's not still pinned to your back, or you only drew it this far. So, like in a bar or an inn, if somebody shoves you against the wall, they then beat the crap out of you, and you never draw your sword. And no one would have done that historically. Like, and then it's an absurd way to wear a sword on horseback. And I know this is bad news to Tolkien fans, but most people in the world who wanted to go more than 5 miles went on horseback. So, and there's like dozens of different rigs, just like modern cops and SWAT team officers and so on have all kinds of different rigs for handguns. There were all kinds of different rigs for longswords, and you can study them, you can look them up, and not a one of them was across the back.
Okay, interesting.
I will tell you that the most popular way to carry a really big longsword, the kind that fantasy loves, is unscabbarded under your arm or over your shoulder. You just walk around with it over your shoulder.
Yeah, that's so much cooler, right?
Yeah, it's
just
so much
walking around
cooler,
like
and
that.
it's right there. In a bar fight, you can just bring it right out. And then most people who carried those giant swords had a child, because child soldiers weren't a problem then, had a child to just like take care of the sword. You just hand it to your kern, and he cleans it, gives it back to you clean. Yeah.
There you go. Aurora Simmons here says, it's easier to walk through brush though with the strap to your back. It's fine to wear it on your back if you don't need it. Also, who's carrying your bedrolls?
Aurora Simmons would know because she's worn a bunch of longswords. So she has my total respect. But in this instance, I would say I've worn my longsword through brush on a waist hanger, and it's really not that bad. In fact, one of the things I love about the real Italian rig I use is that as you go over obstacles, the way it's built, it sort of follows the obstacles. The scabbard just trails over and goes back to its position all the time, like it was built to do that, which it is.
Nice, awesome. So tell me a little bit about about your actual fighting in medieval harness. How does that work? What are the rules? Are you using like blunt blades or sharp blades, or how does it work?
Yeah. So anybody who really wants to deep dive into this can look at the International Armizare Society website. I belong to the International Armizare Society. I will actually be testing for a new level later this year. And so will Aurora Simmons, who was just talking on there.
She had to mention that she was totally joking, by the way.
So there's a whole set of rules which I will describe briefly. So the ideal, and a lot of this is historically based, the ideal armor to wear for competitive fighting is late 14th century armor. And the reason is that it's a mix of plate and mail. And it's a mix that leaves some mail exposed. And that is pretty much how we score. There's almost nothing you can do, even with a poleaxe or a spear, that will penetrate plate armor. So the helmet, the breastplate, but any thrust will penetrate, any heavy thrust will penetrate chainmail. And people have done these tests. We've done the tests. You can take riveted ringmail, really nice, small riveted ringmail, and you can put it over a dead pig. And with a flick of your fingers, a real medieval longsword will just go pop right through the mail. And it may not go very deep, but I promise you, you can only take so many 2-inch deep stabs to your groin or your underarm before you're really desperately unhappy. And if you consider the lack of antibiotics, you may just die later anyway. So in the IAS rules, mostly blows to your plate armor don't count, and blows to your chainmail do count. Mostly thrusts count, which I have to tell you, there are other organizations that do medieval fighting and they don't like thrusting because they consider it dangerous. What they mean by that is they don't want to pay the money to wear good armor. And so they don't allow thrusting. And it's funny because if you look at all medieval weapons, the spear, the spike on the poleaxe, the longsword. They're all thrusting weapons. Thrusting is the
Right.
only way to kill a person in heavy armor. So it's kind of
Right.
silly to be cutting at people in armor.
Yeah.
Super silly, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Anyway, we also have wrestling that would look remarkably like MMA to people, because another
Wow.
way to win a fight is to immobilize somebody or throw them to the ground, pin their arms. We don't actually do joint locks that lead to breaks. We could, but then we wouldn't be friends. But
Right.
but people will set up a joint lock, and then you're expected to tap out just like in any martial art. And yeah, so we have locks, throws, holds, and then the scoring of the weapon against the armor.
Awesome. Wonderful.
And
We have a question here from
go.
we have a question from Zach Judica, who says, "What about bows? Can a nicely strong arrow penetrate plate?"
So basically, no. I realize that the English Warbow Society likes to pretend that it can, but there's no
Yes.
evidence. And
Okay,
look,
interesting.
I recognize that there are a handful of people in the world who can pull a 220-pound longbow, and they can penetrate non-hardened steel. And there's a really good book, which I recommend to everyone who wants to argue about this, called The Knight and the Blast Furnace. And it is about exactly how armor was made in the Middle Ages, and a whole lot of testing of existing armor, and a whole lot of pure scientific metallurgy, and a whole lot of contact examples of weapons against various metallurgical samples, and a whole lot of super nerdy information that I love, like how much medieval chainmail turns out to be ancient Roman chainmail that was just continuously repurposed, which is amazing.
Fantastic.
But by and large, an arrow from a bow shot from more than, say, 20 yards is absolutely not going to penetrate plate armor. But
Wow. Okay.
here comes the but.
Mm-hmm.
A third of my body area is only covered by chainmail, and the arrow will penetrate that. And then also, if you've ever met a World War II veteran of a tank, they will all agree that, well, in a war game, you can sit there in your Tiger tank being shot by an American Sherman, and you, in a game, know that every 75mm round is going to bounce off. But in real life, after the third one hits your turret, you start really thinking about getting the hell out of your tank. And that also applied at a morale level in the Middle Ages.
Right.
So if you're walking forward into the arrow storm, and we know this because the greatest knight of the Middle Ages wrote about it, every English arrow or Turkish arrow or Hungarian arrow that hits your helmet or your plate armor makes you think, damn it, that could have been in my arm. That could be in my groin. I could be dead now.
Yeah.
And really soon, you know, like, I'm not walking forward any further into the Janissaries or the English archers or the French archers.
Right.
That being said, only the crossbow, the arbalast really, and the musket will just penetrate plate armor. And by the period that we reenact, the rich had hardened steel plate armor, which you can literally drive a truck over and it won't deform. And you cannot, my good armor pieces would probably stop a 9mm bullet. Like, I don't want to test it to find out, but hardened spring steel, it's like not easy to penetrate.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Wow. It's amazing it didn't last for longer then, I guess. But I guess once you get into cannons, there's not much you can do.
If you read The Knight in the Blast Furnace, and I'm going to be super sciencey here, you'll discover that by the end of the 15th century, they stopped making hardened steel armor because it cost too much. In fact, they stopped making steel armor altogether because they could make it just out of iron and do with sheer thickness what they had been doing with fancy metallurgy. And because of that, they started the myth of the gendarme who was so heavy he had to be winched onto a horse. That is the so-called early modern period.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. Fascinating. I didn't know that. I should know that, but I didn't. Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. And we can dive in with your historical knowledge as well as we go.
It's all pastry.
But it's all pastry.
All pastry.
Tell me more. Why pastry?
Because I work at a local bakery, with a fabulous big table and a place to write and great coffee and really good pastries. So I allow myself 2 a day. I think some of my readers think I eat 20 a day, but it would be really hard to keep my girlish figure.
Yes.
And fight in armor. And you know, armor is super unforgiving of changing size.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay. Yeah.
it's not your friend. It's made of steel. So if it fits you at a certain weight, you have to stay that weight all the time. And that's for real. Anyway, my writing is about pastry. I really like to write with people around. I do not write well by myself. Sitting alone is not my style.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I get up every morning. I try to be at work by 8:30, and by 2:30 in the afternoon, I'm done. And I do absolutely nothing in between. I do not look at social media. I do not advertise. I do nothing. I just write.
Yeah.
From the time I start to the time I'm done. I won't say I never experienced writer's block, but my dad, who's been a writer since he was 20 years old and is now 87, says that writer's block is a lie that writers tell themselves to not work. And
yeah, I think you're right.
well, it's my dad's view. I have a couple of times encountered insoluble character problems or temporarily insoluble character problems.
Yeah.
But my father taught me that you can't leave your computer without writing 5 pages, no matter what you think is going on.
Oh, wow. That's great. Good for him.
That has been my rule since I started writing. So
fantastic.
If I can't get on topic, I'll write a different scene. Sometimes I literally will just write X, 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 X in a long line all the way across the page, and then I'll just move on. And sometimes I just leave a note for myself saying, somehow or other, Aranther has to figure out that he's not in love with Dahlia. Right? That's going to be complicated.
Yeah,
that's going to be getting into the mind of late adolescence. I'll just cover that off tomorrow.
There you go. Yeah. No, I think there's something to be said about writer's block being a bit of a myth, because it's often not about the writing; it's about the writer, right? I mean, it's not. It's the writer himself that needs to, get a little bit of fresh air, or needs to read something, or needs to distract himself, or maybe the well's dry or something like that. Or, as Cat Wolf is suggesting, perhaps the pastry was wrong, and so Cat Wolf is asking, what pastry is the most motivating one for writing?
I have a question for you, but I'll answer Cat first. The most motivating is definitely an almond croissant. Almond croissant is the pastry of choice when the going gets tough. The tough get an almond croissant. And
nice.
My question for you, Nick, is do you find when you're writing that if you have a problem, sometimes you can solve it by reading somebody else's writing?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if I'm not writing, then I know I have to set aside my writing and go read something. And oftentimes it's completely not connected to fantasy or the time period that it's set in. Even if because most of my fantasy is at least mildly based on some historical period. Yeah, I'll just go read some Jane Austen, or I'll read some Robert McFarlane or something completely off the wall. And it's amazing the kind of things that suddenly you get this detail, or even the way a word is, the way a sentence is phrased, and suddenly you're like, okay, now I know exactly what to do with that entire scene that I was having trouble with. So yeah.
Nicholas, have you read The Tsar of Love and Techno?
No. Should I?
I think you should.
Oh wait, that's Cat Valenti, isn't it?
No, it's Mara.
Okay, all right, I'll write it down.
Anthony Mara? Someone help me out.
Yeah, okay.
It's
Tsar of... Oh, I have heard about this. Yes, I haven't read it yet, though.
It's an absolutely fantastic book, and rather like what you were saying about mine, I won't say I hated it, but I spent a while going like, really are we going to do this? Disconnected short stories don't make a novel. Yeah. And then gradually I realized that they sure do make a novel. It was, oh wow, it's actually brilliant, and I won't even tell you how because that would be a spoiler. But I was I'm not going to say I'm going to run off and do this anytime, but I thought someone should do this in fantasy. Like somebody should use this very brilliant set of plot devices. And he's just a flat good writer. Anyway, I was re-enlivened by him. I kind of like left that book going like, wow, I want to be a better writer. And I want to pay more attention to these little details of how one scene feeds another scene.
Yeah, no, totally. For me, it's oftentimes, especially, I mean, I read a lot of fantasy, so it's usually the non-fantasy that gives me the moments of epiphany. So, um, in general, Christian, does writing energize you, or does it exhaust you, or is it both?
Totally energizes me. I haven't really written very much for a week because I just put out this thing, which I will describe later, which is a reader's
Yeah.
guide to cold iron. And that required some writing, but there was a lot of like coordination of illustrations and a lot of just learning how the digital media universe works to get things onto
Hmm.
my website, which I also updated for the first time in 3 years. And
Oh yeah. Okay.
um, and I feel weird and kind of like flabby because I haven't written in a week. And
Yeah, interesting,
I
right?
came home from Spain and Italy because you were asking about fighting in armor, and I really didn't even get started. I fought in my favorite tournament in Italy after the Camino, and that was quite an experience. Doing it right after the Camino was an experience, and then doing the
Yeah.
Camino, a huge experience. And and then we ran an event here almost immediately called the Deed of Alms, which we did to raise money for homeless people. And
Oh
all of
wow,
those things will result in writing. And I have not sat down and
fantastic.
done that writing yet. So I feel like
Wow,
a
wow.
fire hydrant that has been pumped, like
Hmm.
there's a lot of
Hmm.
pressure to
Hmm.
write. Yeah, it totally energizes me. How does it tire you out or does it get you going?
So my problem is that I'm nowhere near your situation where I can where my writing can support me. So I have to do a lot of different things to support myself financially, um, and so if you don't write for you know this if you don't write for a while, there's a bit of a hump to get over, and if the longer you don't write, the higher that initial climb is. So sometimes that climb is so excruciating that I almost have to go home and sleep afterwards if I don't get over it. But as soon as there's some sort of flow, especially if it's 2 or 3 days in a row and I'm already starting to see the story in my sleep, and dream it out. And then, I'm having dialogue in my head, in between conversations with people. Then it gives me so much energy. But it's scary also at the same time because even when I sit down, you have to get past that brain stage. Like your brain gets in the way, your analytical brain. But once I get past that, then it's nothing but energy. I just have to remind myself sometimes that will
For
come.
for what
Um,
it's worth, I I always, when I've been away more than one day, I reread a great deal of what like. I read back, and if I've been away for more than
yeah,
2 weeks, I read the whole book before I
yeah, yeah.
start.
I do that too.
And
Yeah,
usually, when I
yeah, I
read
do
the
that
whole
too.
book, I find things I want to fix, and in the process of fixing them, I'm back in the headspace, and then writing
Yeah.
just comes.
It's interesting that you say that because a lot of writers, a lot of very famous experts who know what they're talking about will tell you that you should never have your editing hat and your writing hat on at the same time. And I find that approach of reading a little bit before I start writing the next scene to be invaluable. I think it's absolutely I can't do it without it. So I don't know what they're talking about, but yeah,
I will limit myself to saying that, like raising children, writing
yeah,
is different for each person. There is not
yeah,
a uniform way. And one thing I feel that no
absolutely,
one should ever do is really take anyone else's advice on writing. Like
yeah.
every person comes to writing a different way. And every time I see one of those stupid master classes advertised on Facebook, I want to say like, no, stop, don't do that. I'm not
Learn
here
how to
telling,
write like Malcolm Gladwell.
yeah, you can learn to write exactly like somebody far more famous than you, but that won't sell any books or make you a better writer.
Nope, and you won't enjoy it. You'll hate it. Was there ever an early experience in your life where what does that say?
Oh, it's backwards.
Uh, oh,
Fascinating.
Tsar of Love. Oh, it's signed. Look at that. Is it signed or is that part of the cover?
No, no, I think this is my wife's copy.
Oh, cool. It's just backwards, so I had to.
I know.
I had
I hadn't
to-
realized it was going to come backwards. Oh well.
yeah, no, I'll definitely check it out. Um, so here's a question about some early experience maybe you had in your life when you realized that stories had power. I suppose your dad being a writer would help.
Sorry, you have to say that again. I missed the last part.
So, was there ever an early experience in your life when you realized that stories had real power to like change people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Now I understand. Yeah. First of all, because my dad wrote them, and I think I read one of his books when I
Yeah.
was 11 or 12, and was sort of flabbergasted that my dad wrote this. He didn't seem that abnormal until that moment. But I grew up with stories. My grandfather told stories really well. My dad tells a good story. My grandmother told a good story. And I've always sort of loved the power of the story. And I guess especially the personal story, like the story spoken in a voice. I think part of the appeal of audiobooks is that it's like having your dad or your brother read you a story, right? Like, here's the voice just telling you the story, and it's very Homeric. But
exactly.
super powerful. I would like to say that I wrote a fantasy novel when I was 16 years old that I promise no one will ever see, because it is so
come
bad.
on.
So bad.
Come on.
So bad. Elves in space. Elves in space.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I had ninja warriors riding on bears in space. So that's a close second, I think.
Not.
Anyway, so talk to us about Cold Iron.
You know what's funny? There is a character in my 16-year-old fantasy novel who actually made it into Cold Iron.
No way. Okay.
And that's bizarre. I guess I've always wanted to have this character. Cold Iron is a super hard book to describe. And it's funny because I think because people imagine I'm all about history, I am continually asked to describe it in historical terms. But where Red Knight was very definitely culturally set in a European high Middle Ages, late 14th century artifact culture, Cold Iron is way too complicated to describe in a sentence, even that way. And it's also very strongly about the world we actually live in. Now, it's a fantasy world, but it's about a million shades of gray and having to make decisions and having to decide if some things are fake news and having to decide if people are telling the truth or lying. There's a famous, maybe not famous enough, philosopher, theologian really, named Duns Scotus. And Duns Scotus said that the problem with reasoning by example is that if you worked all your life in a blacksmith shop, you might come to the conclusion that iron is hot. But that, in fact, despite thousands of examples of horseshoes and hammers that were hot, the truth is that iron comes out of the ground cold and is usually cold. And that's why my book is called Cold Iron, because it is about not reasoning from example. And and it's also, I mean, it's a trilogy and there's a lot of sword fights in it, but it's also about violence and about why people use violence or don't use violence. A long time ago, I'm going to say a dangerous thing. We'll see how many people leave the conversation. I came to a disconcerting thought about Star Wars. I asked myself, how come the Jedi Knights never even ask their opponents to change their minds? They just reach for their lightsabers. And I thought, like, if we had knights in our civil society, wouldn't we want them to be, like, super careful? In fact, aren't we kind of annoyed by how our police officers behave? And they're not even knights, right? So wouldn't we want our knights with super powerful lightsabers to be very, very careful about when they engaged in violence? And that question sort of informed how Cold Iron goes. But it's a high magic world. It's definitely epic fantasy. It's definitely got grim, dark touches, because I also wanted to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, which interests me greatly. I have some military experience, and I have a lot of fans and readers who have a lot more military experience than me and a real experience of post-traumatic stress disorder. And they keep writing me these really amazing essays saying, please write about this. Please remind people that, you know, and one thing, I had a guy a couple of years ago say this, and I love to say this live. He said, come on, you and I both know that nobody knows what sword cut they used to put down their opponent. Like, he basically said, like, we all know that once the shit starts, you have no idea what you're just functioning. You just do that thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
and people call it
Yeah.
being in the black or in the mirror or
Yeah.
whatever. But you just, you do what you have to do, and then you sort of come out the other side. And really, sometimes only
Right.
then do you think, oh, I did that thing and I did that other thing. And I'm just trying to touch on this. I don't want to ruin the enjoyment of fantasy. I
Yeah.
am a little bit against, I want to be careful what I say here, against the pornography of violence, like
Yes.
violence just for the sake of violence.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then at a whole other level, and it is a whole other level, when I started writing these books, they were actually going to be about swordsmanship. And I sort of changed
Okay.
my mind and made it a much more complicated spy novel-ish thing. But every sword fight, bar none, is different, and each one of them is to teach a different lesson. So
Oh my
the
goodness.
sword community should read the books and say, oh, this is about this, and this is about this. And it's not that it's
That's
super
awesome.
technical. It's just like,
Yeah. Yeah.
at one point they fight in the dark, and at one point they are
Yeah.
trying not to be heard. And there are all these
Oh
little
wow. Awesome.
little
Awesome.
points, and I'm trying to sort of riff my way through on all the different things you can do with
Yeah.
various kinds of violence.
No, it's fascinating listening to you talk about this because I honestly believe, and I've talked about this a lot with other authors and when I'm asked to speak at functions and things, but fantasy seems to be the best maybe genre in which to transmute the truths that we're trying to express about our everyday life in a way that can be passed along to people without any sort of preachiness or without any kind of any taint of ideology, maybe we can say, in a way that they can just accept it and kind of absorb it in a much more essential and a much more natural way than if you were to just tell them something,
Yeah,
What do you think? Do you think that's true?
I think fantasy is maybe an even better venue than science fiction.
Yeah, I
Science
think so too.
fiction
Yeah.
presupposes some things, and fantasy presupposes almost nothing. Like
Yeah.
you can do anything with magic, literally, and that kind of releases you to tell whatever story you want to tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to talk about, this part is historical. I wanted to talk about why multiculturalism always triumphs over simple
Yeah.
nationalism and racism. And hey, historically speaking, nobody has ever yet had a successful empire based on we're superior to you.
Yeah.
Most of the successful empires say, oh, come on with us, you'll be okay.
Right. And as soon as they make that switch, then they start going to decadence
Yeah.
and start falling
And
apart.
I sort of wanted to make that point and some other points because we seem to be at a moment. We're at a moment where, at least in the United States and some other countries I could name, people are openly espousing things that in my generation we just find appalling. I mean, we grew up playing not cops and robbers, but Americans and Nazis. So
Oh wow.
and no one ever wanted to be the Nazis.
No. No kidding.
So I just find it's definitely a moment. And I wanted to write about that moment and write about what it looks like to me when somebody wants to turn the clock back and reinvent a past that was really grim. I'm a historian in my heart, I admit it. And I think perhaps people who don't study history more easily skip over what Central Germany was like during the 30 Years' War. Like, oh yeah, it was no big deal. Armies just ran over peasants for 60 years. No, that was terrible, actually. Actually, that was really terrible. And you can't just skip over that. And it's funny because there's a whole branch of history that does skip over that called military history. And I got really incensed a couple of years ago when one of my book covers referred to me as a military historian. And I'm like, oh, please. I'm very interested in military history, but not the kind that goes like, oh, forget the raped women and the dead children. We're just interested in the uniforms in the battlefield. No.
And how they arrange themselves against each other and all that sort of thing.
Exactly. That is a very arid, non-studious form of military history. And it's kind of a big lie because it pretends that the people who had active commission in the war are the only people who mattered. It's kind of funny too, because in the world of Me Too and the world of discussing openly sexual harassment and and people's role in these things, I find that very often we don't do the same thing with violence. We don't talk about the difference between being a fighter pilot and being a refugee. The fighter pilot has a huge investment in the war, a lot of training, and probably is completely willing to fly every mission. Whereas the Syrian woman trying to get her 2 children to Canada, no interest in the war whatsoever, did not volunteer, did not want to be there. And that's not the story that's usually told in fantasy. I'm not saying I left up to tell that story, but because you're so interested in Russian history, a ton of Russian history invests in that, and a ton of Russian history, especially like dealing with Kazakhs and stuff like that. You're talking about people who survived vast amounts of oppression to try and build a life that was completely different from the life they were. There's a lot of good stories there, but they're tough stories to tell.
Absolutely. No, they are. They're very complex. They're very difficult. There's a lot of darkness there, but there's a lot of light too. And that's what you're speaking about little bits of grimdark, and that's why I can take my grimdark in little bits, as long as there's equal equal weight given to the fact that there's still that bit of light that comes through in small and unexpected places. It's like this story about, you're speaking about the Nazis. There was an amazing story I read for all of the blackballing we make of the and correct blackballing of the Soviet Union and all they did, and Stalin and all that. But there was this amazing story about that I read about how the Nazis had taken a bunch of kids from deep in the Russian wilderness, and they had taken them to an experimental hospital, and they were drawing blood from them. They were from 8 to 10, something like that, very small children, because children's blood has more vitality, and so they were using that blood to infuse wounded Nazi soldiers. And it was an epic story of heroism where this one soldier got them all into a plane as the Nazis were about to get him, and the Nazis started to shoot at the plane, and the plane started to go down. The cockpit was in flames, and he landed the plane, even though his feet were gone. He didn't have legs anymore because they had burned off. And he landed. He was still alive. The kids got out. They came out and they were saved, and then he died. So that's the kind of thing that really.
Yes.
Sometimes we don't hear enough about that nowadays.
Once in a while, the heroes win one. It's a great story.
Exactly. Yeah, isn't it? There's a few questions from the audience that I'd like to get into. First off, there's a technical question. Where do you get proper coaches for sword fighting?
Ask whoever is where is he or she?
I'm not sure. This came from the comment section. So
okay, well,
Jack, Judith, if you can tell us where you're
I
from.
recommend that you go to the International Armizare Society. So armizare is spelled Armizare, armizare. Go to the International Armizare Society website, get on one of the chat groups, and find yourself an instructor. There are first quality sword instructors, frankly, in almost every major city in North America. And if you can't find one, I recommend that I actually have a blog on this subject, and so I recommend people read my blog. But no, it's not about me. It's just about how to find a sword instructor. But if you can't find a sword instructor, take Iaido, Kendo, or Western fencing. They'll all get you the same place. And look at the IAS website. There's how-to videos to get you started and to take you really quite far. And there's ways to do distance learning. And I really recommend that.
Cool. Very nice. And a more philosophical question from the same person. I'm having trouble with writing poetry about war. I usually choke. How do you get back to the proper state of mind for writing if you're writing about difficult subjects?
Writing poetry about war, a Western tradition. So I'm going to ask our viewer if he's ever read any Lovelace. So Lovelace is a 17th century English poet, what we call a cavalier poet. He fought for the king during the English Civil War, and he wrote a lot of really good poetry that nonetheless betrays almost nothing about how war works. And then at the other end of the spectrum, Robert Service is a, I want to say Canadian or maybe English poet who wrote during World War I and writes very directly about the experience of almost everything that I experienced and more. I mean, my military experience was not that shocking. More like my grandfather's experience in the First World War of, you know, weeks and weeks and horror and dead bodies in the trenches and all those things.
Yeah.
Because I get inspiration for my writing from reading other people. So I would say that both Lovelace and Robert Service are great poets who wrote great poetry about war, and they're good sort of starter examples. But the other thing I would say, meaning no offense to anyone, is that I don't know who our viewer is, but I would say if you're writing about love, you should have experienced love. And if you're writing about sex, you should have experienced sex. And if you're going to write about violence, you should have experienced violence. That writing poetry about war without a direct experience of war would not help anyone, because poetry is really about helping other people share an experience, to me. I mean, that may be an aesthetic thing outside of the bounds of this. On the other hand, if the viewer has a direct experience of violence and war, he or she should definitely be writing about it. It's the most helpful thing ever.
I'm sure you don't mean this when you're saying, but it sounds like you may have said something that's similar to write what you know, which I don't think is what you're saying, right? The traditional, the most famous rule for writing, write what you know.
Yeah, I both believe and don't believe right with what you know. Like wow, I could get in a lot of trouble here, and I could also go down various rabbit holes. I will limit myself to saying there are some human experiences that you just make an ass of yourself writing about if you don't know how they work, right? The experience of falling in love. If you don't know what falling in love is like, you should probably just keep that for later. The experience of firing a flintlock musket, on the other hand, you can absolutely learn by watching a YouTube, and you don't have to experience it directly. And in fact, I would say it is the most profound emotional experiences that are hard to duplicate if you have not had them. And one of the things that makes my 16-year-old writing so painful to read is that I am writing about a whole host of experiences that, quite frankly, I have not had. And wow, no one should ever read that.
Yeah. Well, maybe someday will convince you, but this actually goes on to another question that I had here. It dovetails very well. Where was that? Yeah, what kind of scene is the hardest for you to write?
Scenes where people betray themselves. It's super common in real life. We all do it. But those moments where you know perfectly well what you're supposed to do and you do the wrong thing. I wrote an entire book about Alexander the Great called God of War, and the whole book was painful to write, because the whole book is about this sort of superhuman human being who consistently, I mean, by military history standards, he's fantastic. But by any human standards, he was a monster, which is what Aristotle called him. And so I wrote about that. And, you know, ultimately, sometimes you do write what you know. What betrayals do you know? The ones you did yourself. So the whole book was like me looking at the darkest parts of myself, making myself into all of Alexander's failings. Not Alexander's greatness, but Alexander's like fuck upness, if you'll pardon the expression, and searching that out really carefully. Ooh, good fun. Went on and on. My 14-year-old is laughing in the background, by the way. It's great for her to know that Dad spent so much time failing.
It's okay. It's probably a good thing for her to know that.
But those are the hardest scenes to me to write. And then the next hardest is how, it's not hard, it's a joy, but it's a hard joy. How people actually communicate. So in Cold Iron, and I did start out to talk about Cold Iron, and then I sort of drifted off into another subject. In Cold Iron, I have two characters. They're sort of almost co-protagonist. The protagonist and the protagonist's friend, sometime girlfriend. I won't spoil this, but Arantha and Dahlia don't always get along. Everything doesn't go well. And yet, as the books progress, they begin to develop, I hope, that kind of communication that like old married people have. And that is very hard to write, where people speak in code, fight in code, make up in code. And it's hard. I don't want it to make it hard for the reader to read, but I want to give it that tone of easy familiarity that we know from our parents and know from our own lives. And if I can criticize all of fantasy in one blow and thus lose all my friends, often fantasy isn't that great at dealing with the banality of day-to-day relationship stuff. And in a way, that's okay. Like what you write and what I wrote in Red Knight, what that has in common is we both write deliberate epic. And that, in a way, frees us from spending all our time on how our protagonist gets along exactly with his best friend, his dad. Actually, sometimes we have to deal with that, but that's not what our books are about.
Father, son, yes.
But in a way, that's a cheat. And for some people, it's why why epic isn't that much fun. People want to dive in and see that. And I'll admit that books like The Tsar of Love and Techno remind me of how important. We all know, everyone has experienced the feeling of having a fight with your spouse or girlfriend and carrying that fight throughout your day. And then imagine that you're commanding a mercenary company. So now are you like cruel to everybody in your company all day? That's not good leadership. So those scenes can be very tricky to try and handle all the complexity that is any human being, much less 2 or 3 human beings. Yeah, good fun.
Yeah, no, it's great. But of course, whenever you do finish those scenes, those are the ones that stand out the most, aren't they? I mean, those are the ones that people remember the most. They're the ones that you remember the most. They're the ones that are most rewarding.
Well, they're the ones that I remember the most. But then one of my dad's absolute rules is kill the thing you love. So sometimes my most complicated emotive scenes end up on the cutting room floor because I love them, but I'm not positive you'll love them. And then on the other hand, I think from fan response that in the Red Knight books, a lot of the banter between Sauce and Bad Tom, which really is like a bad marriage, are some of the people's favorite bits. So so sometimes that is rewarding.
No, for sure. That's exactly what I thought about when you started talking about bad marriages and fantasy. So yeah, obviously you did that one right. Do you view writing as a kind of a spiritual practice?
Only on really good days. So it is definitely meditative. It's made me think differently about prayer and how prayer works. So yes, but then I really am careful about over-dramatizing or over-romanticizing the process of writing. Because what I tell people, and lots of people ask me writing advice, which I try to be super humble about because I have no idea how other people should write. But it is a job. It's a job. And I don't want to over-romanticize or dramatize it. It's a job. You sit down and you do it. And at some level, it's no different from stocking shelves at Walmart. I mean, I imagine I worked in a grocery store. I remember every day, starting the day, feeling pretty good about my job. And there were elements of it, because I can be super detail-oriented, there were elements of it I kind of enjoyed. And I go like, okay, we're going to do this today. We're going to fix the Tide boxes. They're all going to be in order today. And then by 2/3 of the way through, I'd be bored spitless, just trying to get to the end of my shift. And I have to admit that at one level, there can be a spiritual gratification or a spiritual contact in writing, but at another, there's that same feeling 6 hours into the day that you'd really like to be done with your shift.
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah, it's true. And both are aspects of the spiritual life on some level, right? I mean, when we're talking about spirituality, we're not just talking about being uplifted.
Spirituality is not all goodness and light.
That's right. It's not. In fact, it's very rarely
Yeah.
that. So tell me about the reader's guide that you were working on this past week, and where can we
So,
find it? What is it about?
so first of all, I'm a giant nerd and I enjoy role-playing games enormously. And because Cold Iron is set in a completely imaginary fantasy world that is not as straightforward as, say, the Red Knight, but I will
Mhm.
give you some historical context because this is, I mean, with almost all fantasy, we have to pin it to something. Uh, and I could
Yes,
actually give
yes.
you fantasy things to pin it to. I could say that I have a major city that is like Lankmar, but that dates me because Lankmar is Fafhrd and the Grey Mauser, and like, does anybody read Fritz Lieber anymore? I don't even know. Or
They should.
I could say it was like Merovingia, because it is very much like Merovingia, and that's C.J. Sherry, and that's I don't know, 1988 maybe.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but it's easier to say it's like Istanbul and Venice rolled into a single city. And I
Okay.
love both cities. I love canals. And there's something about Istanbul that is remarkable, and I haven't spent nearly enough time there. Uh, and anyway, I sort of wanted that great city, that great fantasy city center point. And then I
Mhm.
wanted to have a university because I wanted my character to start as basically a university student. And I wanted
Mhm.
it to be a medieval university uh, with all the strangeness and completely personal relationships of
Mhm.
a medieval university. So I had some fun with that. Um, but I
Cool.
also didn't want it to be Western Europe. So it's actually all a mixture of the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Persia, and Byzantine Greece with sort of elements stolen from Russia and other sort of more orthodox. Uh, but you'd be hard put to, I'm giving you names, but that doesn't mean
Yes.
that you could find any simple correspondence like you could in
Right.
Red Knight, where you could go like, this is this and this is this. No,
Yeah, yeah,
I made a
yeah.
stew, and
Okay.
my stew is not centered on London. My stew is centered on Athens, Istanbul, uh, and points a little further east and maybe a little further north,
Mhm.
the Crimea. I hope I've created a sort of different context. So the reader's guide was originally the player's guide for my role-playing game, because
Okay.
when I started all this 3 years ago or 4 years ago, when I had this idea for a novel, I realized it was going to be so different from what I reenact that I couldn't reenact my way through it. I couldn't just like go to
Mhm.
a 17th century reenactment or an 18th century reenactment. And I love role playing games, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write down all my thoughts about this world like it was a role playing game, and then I'm going to run a role
Mhm.
playing game. I'm going to invite my friends, and we're going to sit down and we're going to play. And I want to say
Mhm.
to readers, we didn't play the plot of the novel. In fact, none of
Mhm.
my players have ever met any character from the plot of the novel. That what they did was to explore the world, because real
Mhm.
people playing in a world bounce off things that you forgot about when you were writing a novel. So, when you write a novel,
Yeah.
you're controlling the protagonist and it does what you want and stays inside the bounds. But the moment you allow Aurora Simmons, for example, to play in your world, she immediately says like, so where do I buy a donkey? And you go like, buy a donkey. Wow, hadn't even thought of that. Got to be a place to buy donkeys. Um, and and where does the iron ore come from? Not a question that any of my characters had asked.
Mhm.
Came up in the very first adventure. Where does the iron ore
Right.
come from? Uh, and
Fantastic.
thousands of other things. So I couldn't reenact the world of Cold Iron, but I could run it as a role-playing game and let roughly 15, the party's never bigger than 8, but 15 people play. Um, Roughly 15 people bounce off it.
Mhm.
Some of them have written me notes, and a couple of them have suggested things. So I have updated the guide right along. And then I wrote
Mhm.
Cold Iron is coming out on August 30th. Uh, Dark Forge, or Forge of Darkness, whichever it is, I think it's going to be called Dark Forge, is already done. In fact, I got the edit back today, and I'm happy to say my editor loved it, so I'm going to roll with that. It's a good day here.
Good.
But
Excellent.
it's already done, and I'm already writing book 3, and it's only a 3-book series. So
Yeah.
I sat down to incorporate all the things that maybe had changed about the world from the other direction. So now that I've written the novel, some things are set in stone, right? Because now it's happened. The novel has happened. So the name of this particular god, or the way the Temple of Light looks when you're standing in the street, that's done now. It's in print, so that's not how it is. And then I'm arrogant enough to believe that maybe out there somewhere in the world are 9 people who actually want to play their role-playing game in my world. So for all these reasons, I thought I would release our handbook. And it really is, remember the player's handbook in D&D? It's like a short player's handbook. Just to tell you, how gods work, how religion works, how the cosmology works. And I will totally admit to people that they can read that guide online, and not one word in 100 of it will ever appear in the novel. This is the background to allow you to play in a role-playing game. I don't guarantee it has anything to do with the novel, except that it helped me enormously and it helped my players. And, one of the reasons that, this is going to sound silly to you, especially as you're religious, but one of the reasons in the Red Knight that I chose to use Christianity as the fundamental religion is not actually because I'm Christian. It's because it's a context that everyone understands. And pardon my blasphemy, when a character says, Jesus Christ, we all know exactly what that means and what that implies, and to a medieval mind, how everyone else flinches at the blasphemy. But if I say Korin Ring Splitter, even from context, no one is that impressed. And I really wanted to capture the flavor of medieval angry blasphemy in Red Knight. So in this book,
you got it.
I have tried to actually dive into the creation of a cosmology and a theology where people use the names, invoke the gods, or ignore the gods, or whatever. And I've tried to do that in a way that I see around me in Toronto with Muslims and Sikhs. Today I met a Sikh magic user. That is no joke. In a parking lot at Canadian Tire.
No way.
A Sikh astrologer came up to me and told me that I was at a critical moment in my life. Anyway, I am merely trying to reflect what I see around me. And in a multicultural world, I assume that there would be different belief systems, and I try and have those. And I thought I'd put this guide together so that those people who care, and I think we all know who they are, there's a certain kind of, I won't even say fan, there's a certain kind of reader who really deep dives into your material and then goes like, how did this work? You made that up. That doesn't work. And I thought I would provide those people like me, with like, here's a guide so you can know. So when somebody swears by Korin Ring Splitter, you're like, I know who that is. Instead of my having to do a huge exposition in the text, which doesn't work for anyone.
No, it doesn't. You're right. And it's great because if you have that as the background, then it just makes the writing much richer because you already have the world created. I mean, this is why so much fantasy is still doesn't quite reach Tolkien's level, is because Tolkien had all that stuff done before. He wrote the languages, he had the mythology and all that stuff it seeps through every single line, every single word, every single poem. And you whether you like Tolkien or not, you can't argue the fact that the world building there is beyond anything. So when you have that even to a small level, it really adds a great level to your writing. So that's good to hear.
I adore Tolkien, just for the record, even though I now suspect that some of Tolkien's ideas are deeply racist. I still can't help but admire. It's great writing. I love Tolkien.
Yeah, me too.
I
can't get enough of them.
Not the movies though. I always give
a
couple of fans by going like,
No. Especially the Hobbit movies. That shouldn't even be talked about.
No, my 14-year-old can't stand the Hobbit movies.
There you go. See, it's an intelligent person. You've raised her right. Awesome. All right. Well, okay. One last question. We've been doing this for over an hour. What do you want your readers to do as soon as they're done with your book?
With Cold Iron,
Any book.
uh, wow, that's a very interesting question. Hold on while I think about that. Well, I guess I'm going to answer this two different ways. One, I hope they'll put it down and stare off into space for 5 minutes, because that's what I
Excellent.
do
Yeah.
when I read a book that just blows me away. I sit there trying to like get my head around all the things that have just gone into my head. So I hope they do nothing for for several minutes. And then,
Good.
wow, I'm being mocked by my daughter, but that's normal. And then, you know, at some level, this is my job. And so I kind of hope they immediately call their two best friends and say, you should read this.
Yeah.
Yeah, B says
200 is better.
200
Yes.
best friends. Yeah, because I could really use more readers. So, but at another level, I would really hope with Cold Iron, and really more, even more with the next two, because Cold Iron is a setup. It's a whole plot and all the things you want, but it's also a setup.
Mhm.
That when people finish this series, I kind of hope they sit and think, oh, that's really true. Ah, that is how the world works. Wow, I want to make sure that Donald Trump never happens again. Things like that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'd like people to think when they're done.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Good. Let's hope. Let's hope that they come away from that with at least half of that. We have a few more questions from the audience here. Let's hear about the Red Knight prequels, please.
Okay, so pardon me, I need to move my hands around.
Yeah.
When I contracted to write a 3-book series, which became a 5-book series, Gillian Redfern and I agreed that I should set it up so that I could write an either YA or maybe grown-up fantasy about how Gabriel Murrians happened. Like, you know, I could string together all the backstory, but there's a lot of hints to his not very happy childhood
Yeah.
and his fairly screwed up parents. So,
Yes.
and we know that he tried to commit suicide and failed. So
Uh-huh.
something happened, and then he's the captain of a great mercenary company. So
Right.
I know that story. I have that story outlined, and after I've written the Masters and Mages series, and I already have the prequel for it written for complicated reasons, which I'll tell you if you want to hear.
Yeah, sure.
And remember, I write pretty fast.
Yeah.
If there's reader interest, I will probably write the prequel, and it will probably be called Gabriel or Prince Gabriel or something like that. And I'll probably write it not as YA, because here's my teaser, because a hero who spends a significant part of the novel living in a whorehouse is unlikely to ever reach the banal level of YA.
Yeah.
Well, we know that Sauce was a prostitute, and we know that Gabriel and Sauce lived together. And
Right.
so, like, and we know that he lived in Liviopolis at some point. So you can put all those things together and figure out that most of the novel is set in Liviopolis, and how it all happens. I could tell you the story now, but then I'd sell fewer books later. So,
No, don't.
So
No spoiler.
that's the prequel.
Okay, excellent. And then there's one more about what's your next project, but I think you've already answered that. So,
well, no, actually, I'd be happy to answer that because I haven't said a thing about historical novels. So,
oh yeah, right.
Gallant has decided to publish the Masters and Mages books, bang, 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 at like 6-month intervals. So they're just going to come out really fast. And then I think we're going to publish The Sword, which is the prequel 1,000 years before, about how this whole world came into existence, which is already mostly written. So it will happen right away.
Fantastic.
The next book I write after finishing the sequel to the final book of the trilogy, which I'm writing right now and is called Lightbringer, is actually going to be the next chivalry novel. So it's a historical about William Gold, and it will be called probably Hawkwood's Sword, and it'll be done around Christmas time and probably out next June. So that's actually my next writing project, and that is strictly historical. And then I have to write another historical, the second part of a 2-book series about Philip Pullman, and that book the first book is called The New Achilles and is out in January. And the protagonist in that novel is not a great warrior. He's an ancient Greek doctor. So that will be a bit of a different, spin.
Cool.
That book's already written and already edited. And they're holding it till January for publishing world reasons, but that book will be out in January. So I have like projects and then some other projects and then some other projects.
Amazing, amazing. I mean, how many books have you written? What are you up to 50 yet?
No, I counted the other day and it was fewer than I thought. I have 36 published novels. So I think when New Achilles comes out next, I think it will be my 40th novel as the publication world goes.
Fantastic. It's unheard of, but that's awesome. Good for you. I wanted to, before we sign off, I wanted to let your readers and my readers know that I'm actually going to be offering a free copy of Cold Iron to one giveaway winner at the end of the month. I'm not asking you to provide that. I'm going to get that myself. So this is part of a collection of novels that oh, look at that. It's beautiful. I love that cover.
I have,
fantastic.
I tell you what, you could give away one and I could give away one. I wouldn't be
All
mailing it for a week, but I have the English edition right here. So you could take two winners and we could mail books to both of them.
All right, let's do that then. All right, so one of them is a part of a giveaway that I'm going to be putting into the comment section right now under the video. And the other one is just going to be anybody who commented during this past video. So if you haven't commented yet, now's your chance just to say something. And that'll be your copy, Christian. And the other one is going to be a collection of novels. The theme is called Uncommon Worlds. So the idea is that this is all kinds of fantasy novels that are not set in traditional Western Europe. So just exactly perfect for Cold Iron. So I've just put that into the comment section. Anybody want to enter? You have plenty of chances to increase your chances of winning. And well, hello there.
That's my daughter, Beatrice.
Excellent. Hi, Beatrice.
Hi.
Be nice to your dad.
No.
No.
No, that's not what age 14 is about.
Yeah, mine's only 4, so I have all that to look forward to.
You have so much to look forward to. Nicholas, I have to tell you, it's all fantastic. But 14, very special.
I'll keep that in mind when the going gets tough. Christian, this has been a real pleasure. If you want to, any parting thoughts for your readers before we sign off?
Well, I'd like to recommend that my readers buy your books. So Nicholas writes Russian fantasy. I think that's a fair thing to say. And I wouldn't call it historical. I would call it more based on a rich fairy tale background, a rich mythological background, a very Christian informed mythological background. And the thing that I liked best about it, and there are a lot of things I liked about it, I think what can rob fantasy of validity is a lack of consistency. And Nicholas, your book was utterly consistent, I think because of your faithfulness to your milieu, but it gave it great power to me. Like, not just lyrical power, but I believed when things were, I'm good at suspension of disbelief, but I hate getting kicked out of a fantasy novel when I go like, that's not what you said. You never mentioned volcanoes. This sudden appearance of a volcano. And you never did that to me. Your characters were great. Do you have a copy of yours to hold up?
Come on. Yes, I do actually.
Be vain.
Let me do that.
Sell a few copies.
So this is the hardcover version. This is not the one that you'd find on Amazon, but this is what it looks like. So
100% recommend this, and not just because Nicholas is teaching me how online technology works. And I think you should all just dive on Amazon and buy yourself a copy now, all 17 of you. And the other thing I want to say is that I hope very much you enjoy Cold Iron, and I really appreciate reader feedback. So friends, if you read my book and like it or don't like it, either way, I'd love to hear from you. I'm very interested in what people say. That's it.
Thank you, Christian. And yes, I echo that. This is something that authors don't say enough, and something that readers don't consider enough. We authors really like to hear from our readers.
We do.
Even if it's to say nasty things, we still appreciate it. So
the fabulous difference between fantasy and historical fiction is that mostly veterans will write to me about historical fiction books, and that's great. And it has given me a special relationship. But in fantasy, everyone writes to you. Sometimes people you didn't want to hear from. No, I don't mean that.
Yes.
You get tons of feedback, and that is fabulous. Thank you, Nicholas.
Awesome.
You're a star. I really appreciate it.
No, it's been great. Thanks so much.
Have a good evening.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.